I would rather not have exact locations listing the nearest road, just to respect the privacy of the family that still owns the property. I have long since had a falling out with my friend at the time, and don't feel he or they would like being approached about this. I like my own privacy respected, so I must accord others the same. The general area at the time was more open farmland, with some large housing developments, in which I lived, just within a mile. There were a good deal of homes scattered here and there, and others in smaller developments. A very large animal, like a Sasquatch, could conceivably navigate or migrate through an area like this at night, using the farmland as cover. But absolutely not stay very long in an area like that, even then, without revealing its presence. I can give you more specific details on topography. Farmland opens up eventually, much more to the north with the state park, the Gifford Pinchot, at the north end of the county. Southern end of York County, where the sightings occurred, is a more likely area, given in terms of what I read of similar topography of other sightings then. Also, much more rural and forested in the early 70s. I picked up my uncle from work. We were traveling down Route 66 towards Del Monte. We were traveling up the hill, where the RVs are sold on the right-hand side, near the gas facility. I was driving at 45 miles an hour when my uncle says, "What is that?" I asked what he saw, and his reply was, whatever it was walking on 2 feet. The sighting was quick, no longer than 5 to 6 seconds, at a distance of 70 yards, on a cloudless, moonlit night. My uncle said the subject was walking up the steep embankment that is covered in almost a foot of snow and bare of trees or brush behind the RV building on a horizontal path on 2 legs towards the very woodland on the top of the hill. He described the color as a uniform black, with no distinguishing clothing. The size, he says, was at least his size, maybe bigger. My uncle is 6'4", and 250 pounds, and even he said it was the size that caught his eye. We can't think of any reason a person would try and traverse such a steep incline, or even going to the top of the hill, because there's nothing but woods once you reach the top. My uncle said it was spooky, because, well, he couldn't think of a reason either. I laughed, and jokingly said it was Bigfoot, and with that, my uncle began rambling about even if it was, nobody would believe us. So, I'm contacting you to see if you guys can maybe solve this. First, I can't believe this even happened to me. I love to hunt and fish, and spend lots of time in the outdoors. This incident took place in 1993 in the northeastern corner of the state of Pennsylvania, near Hancock, New York, on the PA borderline. I was hunting for deer on our regular season. I walked into an area where in the past I've never hunted. Thought I would try it out. The area was a thick pine tree area, bordered by a very large swamp. I found a large pine and sat underneath it. The first thing I remember was this horrific smell, like something rotten. I sat for about an hour when I caught a glance of a bear, or so I thought. I remember saying to myself, what a huge bear that is. Then I realized it was walking upright. Okay, no big deal. Bears walk upright, but not for at least 200 yards. When I put my scope on this thing, I soon realized it was no bear. I saw a Bigfoot. The features were like that of a man. I was shaking so bad. I've never been so frightened in my life. This thing just walked through the woods. I never went to check the tracks. I was that upset. I waited until I was out of sight, and believe me, ran out of there. I told the party I was with. Well, they laughed at me, and that's that. One thing though, this creature was not as tall as Bigfoot's stories I've heard. I'd say it was about 5 foot 10 inches tall, very wide across, and walking with a slight limp. I was a camper at Camp Fairfield in the summer of 1967. I was 8 years old, my first time ever at camp. It was sponsored by the Wilkinsburg Baptist Church. I lived in Wilkinsburg until I graduated high school in 1977. It was a 2-week camp. Arrived on Saturday and left on Sunday. 15 days later. We were assigned cabins by age. My brother, being older, was assigned a different cabin. There was about 10 boys to an open cabin, and a counselor who slept inside with us. I had never really overcome a little bedwetting, and had an accident just a few days into camp. This opened me to huge ridicule and laughter. I need to go to the bathroom late at night to prevent a repeat occurrence. Only one problem. The common outhouse was about 100 yards down an unlit path. There was no way I was going to use a flashlight alone at 8 years of age and go to the bathroom. We were not allowed to pee off the porch into the bushes, for obvious reasons. So, I devised a plan. I would wait until the other boys and the counselor would fall asleep. Then, sneak out a few feet from the cabin to quickly pee. This worked beautifully for about 5 or 6 nights. The head counselor always made head count by 11 o'clock sharp, because lights out was 10. He would come down the path and count all of us by flashlight. Go to each cabin counting. I would wait for this count. Then, after about a half hour, sneak out and back in. This particular night, it was raining very lightly. I remember seeing the counselor with a yellow raincoat as he counted. He went on the path as usual. I remember at lunch, everyone saying a bear had been overturning the garbage at night. This revelation redoubled my resolve not to venture to the outhouse after dark. This night, I heard footsteps returning to the cabin through the forest, not the path from another direction. I thought it was strange that the head counselor would return. He had never returned before, and why would he cut across the woods instead of the path? I heard walking behind the cabin first to the right, and then back to my left, past my head. I heard footfalls come around to the front of the open cabin door. It was just a doorway with no door. As I looked to see who this was, a big gorilla-looking thing appeared at the doorway. He did not step on the porch, but was so big he filled the entire doorway. He was giant. There were at least 4 steps, and his head was at the top of an 8-foot doorway, not on the porch. He looked directly into the doorway. I could see he had black-brown fur and a cone-shaped head. His eyes reflected like a cat's eyes, with an almost red and yellow mix. It was if he could see me looking straight at him. I figured if I could see his eyes, he probably could see mine. I squinted and tried to feign sleep, being far too frightened to move, and did not dare utter a sound or move a muscle. He stood there a good 2 to 5 minutes, then turned and headed up the mess hall. I then heard in the distance garbage cans being turned over. I got up the next morning, asking did a gorilla escape from the zoo, because I saw him last night. And it was a gorilla turning over the cans, not a bear. I had never even heard of a Bigfoot, and I wouldn't hear of him until some 7, 8, or even 9 years later. I, being born in the ghetto, had never heard of anything like that. Everybody cracked up, and I, being young, slept it off. I know what I saw, and they were the dummies, not knowing that Africa wasn't the only place that had gorillas. I had a little pony I was riding, and I was supposed to meet a friend, we'll call Holly, by this little village. I was riding bareback that day, and as my pony, who I called him King, came to the top of this hill, we were on a little back road. He suddenly stopped dead, braced himself, and put his ears straight forward, as though he were looking and listening to something. I looked down the road, and about 400 feet away, I saw this big reddish-brown thing on the road, which happens to be the same color as Holly's horse, and it, whatever it was moving toward us. Keep in mind that all this happened very quickly, but at the time, it seemed like everything was going slowly. My first thought was, oh, Holly must have got thrown, and her horse is heading back to the barn. But, as I was thinking this, the thing was getting closer, and I could see it was very big. It had long, reddish-brown hair, and its arms were swinging back and forth as it walked toward us. Might I add that it had very long arms. As I suddenly realized that this was Bigfoot, my pony, on his own, reared up, turned at the same time, and took off running back down the hill that we had just come up. Believe me, I had to hang on. My biggest fear was falling off, and Bigfoot getting me. I made him turn into this lady's yard, just at the bottom of the hill. I yelled and screamed till she came out. Then she went in and called my uncle. Well, my uncle showed up and followed me in his truck till I got the pony back to the barn. Then he had to come get me in the truck, and we went back to where I saw Bigfoot. He got out, looked at the woods along the road, and he did find a place where the branches had been broken, as if something had left the road and went into the woods. This was all reported to Stan Gordon many years ago. The only things I can really say, as far as being descriptive, are that it was very, very quiet that day. It also seemed as if my pony and I were hit at the same time with the knowledge that this was not something normal coming toward us. We both reacted together. Thank goodness, because being bareback, I almost slipped off. As far as Bigfoot himself, he was very tall, but also very broad, a stocky or sturdy kind of build. He had reddish-brown, long hair all over, although his head seemed like there was less hair, and it was just as small in proportion to his body. I did not see his face. Again, his arms were very long, and they just swung back and forth as he walked. For some reason, those long arms stand out in my mind. Anyway, it doesn't matter to me anymore, after all these years. If anyone believes me or not, I know what I saw. Oh, and when I saw Holly later that day, I had to ask her if she had got thrown off her horse while out riding. She said no. after a 7-inch snowfall the previous day, March 16th, 2004, and a couple more inches overnight, March 17th, 2004. I noticed out the side window of the house large tracks about 4 feet from the side of the house. The tracks had been made at some point in time during the night, because most of the snow had fallen, but a couple of more inches had accumulated in the tracks, making identification unlikely. At first, I thought there was some sort of anomaly from the snow, maybe sliding off the roof or some such thing, just because they were spaced about 5 feet apart. I called my son down to the bottom floor to have a look. From our vantage point, we could only see the tracks along the side of the house, and they then seemed to disappear into the open yard. We had some wind with snow, and I thought it may have eradicated some of the tracks. We both went about our daily work, and later that afternoon, the dish on our satellite needed cleared of sliding snow, and I went around the house. Immediately, I noticed indentations from the tracks that crossed the front yard and went into the woods. I got my camera, took some pictures of the tracks, which were definitely made by a tall bipedal animal. Even a bear walking upright would not have been able to make the tracks so far apart or sustain the upright stride for such a long distance. I then took the pictures of the tracks in relationship to the side of the house, just for scale, and also in relationship to my own stepped-off end-to-end boot tracks and snow between the tracks. The tracks came from the open field side of the property through the yard near the house and continued across the front yard, off into the woods. There was no indication that the animal had stopped or paused at any time, but the tracks were closer together, slower paced near the woods. It seemed as if the animal hurried through the open yard and slowed as it neared the relative shelter of the denser woods. I haven't gotten the photos developed yet, so I don't know what I have. Snow is not the best thing to try and get a photo of. My incident occurred on the second day of deer season in 1986 or 87. I was hunting alone in the afternoon, and the woods were quiet. It was the second day of antler deer season, and I was surprised I didn't hear any shooting. I was near the top of a ravine and standing on the ground next to a tree where I could then survey the valley and sides of the ravine. At about 3 o'clock to 3:30 p.m., I just got an odd feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. I had hunted and hiked in the woods for the past 10 years all the time. Never felt that way. I have even done a lot of night hunting and was even lost in the woods one night. I still never felt that way. Before long, I heard what I assumed were a couple of hunters talking to each other loudly, but what they said made no sense. It sounded like the Japanese language, played backwards. The hunters were moving uphill and covered a distance of about 200 yards in just 12 seconds. There was a foot of snow on the ground, and the hill had roughly a 30-degree grade. I did the math. It's about 45 miles an hour. I was puzzled and just figured my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, I heard loud limbs breaking, expecting to see a deer run ahead of the hunters, so I got ready. After about 5 minutes of movement out of the corner of my left eye, something got my attention. There was a lone pine tree swaying, like it was in a hurricane. The top of the tree was moving severely to the left and right. We're talking about 40 degrees here. A pretty serious movement. Something was standing under the tree, which appeared to be moving it, It was about 7 feet tall, and I saw it for about 5 seconds. Its arm came down, and it took a step forward. It then moved a couple steps and was behind a group of trees. I would say the color of the hair was medium brown, with a slightly lighter area. When it stepped behind the trees, it never came out the other side. Keep in mind that these trees were spaced about a foot apart, and roughly 8 inches in diameter. The odd thing was that you could not see any hair between the trees or movement, even through my scope. I was about 70 yards from the thing, and couldn't understand where it went. I knew it would have left tracks, but something overwhelming told me to stay away. I had what others described as a sense of doom, which is a great description. That was it. No smell or other events. I never knew what to think of what happened, and stopped hunting after that. Since then, I found this site, the BFRO, and that memory came rushing back after reading a number of other stories. I did not get a good look at the thing, but it was not anything that I had ever seen in the woods. Hi, I'm about to tell you about the very frightening encounter with Bigfoot, or Sasquatch. I'm 13 years old, and I'm being very serious about this. I like to joke around, but this is no joke. I am so amazed about what I saw, just because it is so rare and unusual. I hate it, because I try and tell everyone in school, but nobody believes me, and sometimes frustrates me so much when they don't believe me. But here's my story. My dad bought a cabin about 1 year ago, I think. On Saturday, June 2nd, 2001, we went to visit the cabin. Later on, at about 10 o'clock p.m., I was on the porch just reading, and it was cold for June here in Pennsylvania, about 50 to 60 degrees. At about 10:35, I thought I heard something in the brush about 30 feet from where I was sitting. It sounded like footsteps in the leaves, like when you are walking in the autumn and the leaves crunch. I didn't think much about it at first, until I heard a twig snap pretty loudly, so I turned the light on. I saw something crouching, maybe a bear, but we don't get many black bears, and it seemed to have had longer arms. So I kept staring, because even if it was a black bear, that's still pretty cool. But then it stood up, about 7 feet, and I then realized that it was no little black bear. This thing was like a big hairy man, but stockier and with broader shoulders and a much bigger head. I nearly dropped my book that was half open in my hand when, as fast as it stood up, it sprinted away with long steps. I ran in the house to tell my parents. I think they half believed me. Let's just say I got about 3 hours of sleep that night. All I can remember of the description is that it had dark fur, long arms and legs. It was stocky and very, very fast. When I was 12 years old, my mother was busy cooking my breakfast before school, and as she was cooking and looking out the window, I'll never forget, she said, "What in the world is that?" I jumped up, just in time to see a large brown figure going into the woods, toward a stream behind my house. She said that it ran from the neighbors down a power line, and was snapping off sumac like they were twigs. Being young and curious, I ran about 75 yards to the spot that the animal had entered. There was a small drop-off of about 20 feet, then a level spot about 10, and then another 4-foot drop to the creek bed. When I arrived, I observed the Bigfoot at about 50 yards, It must have heard me as it stopped and turned its upper torso and looked at me. The animal was between 6 and 7 feet tall, with a dark face. After looking at me, it made great strides down the creek bed and was gone around the bend. When my father arrived, we went to check the area. There were very large heel prints in the top of the bank, where the animal had landed when it leapt off the top. I hunted those woods for years, and there were times, I'm not gonna lie, I felt I was being watched. We heard vocalizations, and one night, my father said it was a bobcat. After hearing Bigfoot recordings, I believe they are what made the noise. This story was recently told to me secondhand in confidence by a very close friend of mine. He is an Eagle Scout, an honorable man. We are both avid sportsmen and had spent a lot of time together with the other sportsmen in the woods of Pennsylvania. I told him of my interest in the Florida skunk ape. I asked him if he or any of his family had ever heard or experienced any Bigfoot encounters. He told me that it was very ironic that I would ask, because I was present when this experience occurred. We were in the Boy Scouts at the time, at a fall campout with our troop. We were also in the same patrol. Our troop was playing Capture the Flag, right around dusk. We were camping at a place called Hell's Hollow, near Greenville Sportsman Club, out on Route 358. He and another Boy Scout went out into the woods to hide. While they were hiding in some brush, they pushed a Bigfoot that rambled out of the brush and away from them at a very alarming rate of speed. He said that it was definitely bipedal and was huge. My friend stated that he was scared to death and that they made a promise not to tell anybody for fear of ridicule. He stated that he has never told anybody the story. I couldn't get any details as to the size or even the scent of the animal. He did state that he did not see its face. I told him of my intent to report the story, and he said he would discuss it if he was properly contacted by the BFRO. I had 2 occasions to observe an unknown creature in the woods of western Pennsylvania. The first was in the fall of 1986 as a teenager. I was parking in a desolate location called Hell's Hollow, about a half-mile away from a Boy Scout camp. I was only pulled off the road enough not to block traffic, just because I did not want to get stuck in the muddy lane. While we were sitting there, talking, a figure of large proportion walked past the front of the truck. If I had to guess, 7 to 8 feet tall and around 400 pounds. All I saw was a large dark brown biped, about 3 feet in front of the truck. It ignored us totally and was gone into the thick brush. It was dark, and no further observation was made. I hit the key and split. The girl I was with evidently did not see this because she was clueless as to why I made such a hasty retreat. The second sighting occurred in the fall of 1988, in the early fall, while hunting in the same area. Actually, we parked in the same place. We crossed the small creek at the bottom of the hollow and proceeded west up the next hillside, which is very steep. We separated to better our chances of seeing squirrels. I walked about a quarter-mile north along the ridge and sat down. After sitting there for about 2 hours, I had seen nothing. I went back down the hill to go and find a friend. As I hit the bottom of the hill and started across the creek, I could see my friend looking my way. As I got to him, He just kept looking past me. I thought he had seen something to shoot, and turned. All we saw was a dark brown or black long-haired creature running up the steepest part of the hill. It took me about 3 to 7 minutes to cover that hill on less sloping ground, walking downhill. This thing ran up it in an entirety of 15 to 20 seconds. I know, I would have to climb the slope and maybe need a rope to just get up it. It ran sort of like an ape-like, on all fours, pulling its way up with the front paws. The guy I was hunting with doesn't believe in Bigfoot and says it must have been a bear. Bear are around the area, but here in PA, they are very rare, and bears don't run in such a manner as this did. I was returning home from an NFL football game that I had attended out of state. It was about 8:45 p.m. The road I was traveling on had a lot of bends, with patches of wood on both sides, broken up by houses every so often. It is a back road that connects two different towns. The posted speed limit ranges from 10 miles an hour to 45. I was traveling at about 55 to 60 on the straighter sections. I was trying to get home. I had already been driving for a couple of hours. And this is where it happened. One of my good friends was sitting in the front with me. We had the radio up loud and was singing and staring straight ahead. 2 more of my friends were in the back seat, just talking. As I came around a bend into a straightaway with woods on both sides, something caught my vision just in the edge of the headlights, or high beams. I saw the mid and lower torso and legs of what appeared to be a person. It appeared to be crossing the road. I saw it take a right, then left stride, and then went into the trees on the right side of the road. I vaguely saw the color. It was a light brown. When I first saw the movement, I thought it was a person going into the woods. This is the movement it had. However, it glided with great speed, and it happened so quickly, I thought that I had imagined it until I looked at my friend sitting next to me. He was staring back at me. This made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I asked him if he had seen that, and he yelled, "Yeah." I slowed down to about 40 miles an hour with the intent to stop, not really knowing what to do. And when the 2 in the back seat yelled, "What's going on?" I said that me and my friend saw something, and the 2 in the back told me to keep going. They didn't want to stop. I now wish I had. On the opening day of antler deer season in 1982, my father, a family friend, and myself encountered a strange figure walking towards us in the pre-dawn woods. This occurred in the state forest land in north-central Pennsylvania. There was about half a foot of snow on the ground, but the temperature had risen all night, leading to fog and drizzle by dawn. We had just walked about a half-mile down a logging road towards our spot. We were catching our breath before ascending a steep hill when we noticed a hulky figure approaching us, walking upright through some fallen timber that covered a beaver swamp in that area. This figure was dark in color, no red or orange hunting clothing, carried no visible equipment, including a flashlight. Its ability to navigate through the terrain in the dark was an immediate signal to us that something out of the ordinary was going on here, and did not answer our attempts to communicate. It stopped about 50 feet away from us, looked in our direction, then headed back where it had come. Our reaction at the time was that this was probably the dumbest hunter we had ever seen. But in later years, especially with some reports of Bigfoot sightings coming from Pennsylvania, we wonder who or what it was. There's no doubt for any of us that this was definitely not a bear. My mother, brother, and I had just recently moved to a secluded community on the outskirts of land known as White's Woods. We moved in September, and it wasn't until that summer that strange noises were heard. In July of '96, at around 2:30 in the morning, no earlier than 2, never later than 3 a.m., strange whistling could be heard from the woods at the fringe of the neighborhood. It sounded like whoops, with the rise at the end of the whistle. It was a very high, shrill sound. My family and I are not outdoorsmen, so I just assumed it was a bird. It happened always in the early morning, several hours before dawn, and always from the same location. We simply assumed it was a bird. The following year, from July to August, always at the same time in the same location, the whistles could be heard. This time, branches could be heard snapping. I went to school at the University of Pittsburgh. On campus, there lives a falcon, and I was lucky enough to see it take 2 pigeons. And there was a commotion when this happened. Assuming an owl took a rabbit, I took these occurrences as eerie, yet explainable. However, what happened the following year is what gives me pause. My brother and I, having put up with these sounds for 2 years, thought we would investigate it, and anything happened the 3rd year. Sure enough, 2:30 a.m. in July of the 3rd year, the whistler returned. My brother and I are fit men. He was 28 at the time, and I was 30. We play a lot of baseball, so we grabbed our bats and headed out. There are no streetlights in the area, and once outside, the whistling seemed to fill the air. It was very loud, and quite easy to pinpoint. About 100 yards from our house, something was whistling amid the brush and trees. The height of the sound was about 7 feet, high off the ground, yet discernible to know it was not coming from the trees. My brother and I investigated, baseball bats in hand. About 25 yards from the whistling, something strange happened. The whistling continued in its rhythmic, rising cadence, but as we approached, something growled underneath the whistle. I don't know how else to describe it. The whistle continued with a growl at the same time. The growl sounded wet, and we were so close we could actually hear it take in air. The whistle growl sent us, baseball bats in hand, running for home. The whistler returned the following year, but only once. We did not investigate. It hasn't returned since. After the preemptive investigation, it came back only rarely, and now it seems to be gone. This occurred when I was about 15 years old, but I remember it as if it were yesterday. When I tell the story, even to the friends that were there with me that night it happened, they laugh. I know what I saw, and I would gladly take any sort of lie detector test made to prove it. It happened around 9:30 p.m. in the summer of 1969. My friends and I had found a way that we could sneak into the community swimming pool after hours. We would peel back a small section of fencing surrounding the patio, and we would crawl through it. We would swim, sometimes naked, for hours at a time. Occasionally, the caretaker would come around to check the pool, and when we saw him coming, we would run through the fence and into a small patch of woods. This would have been right along the Monongahela River. On this particular evening, I noticed the headlights of a car coming toward the pool and sounded the alarm. As I was the first one to enter the wooded area, I ran as fast as I could to get away. As I was running, sometimes looking over my shoulder just to see if my friends were following, I ran into something. This is where the strange event happened. As I fell backwards, I looked up to see what appeared to be a man-like creature staring back at me. Although this figure was man-like in form, it happened to be around 8 feet tall. It was covered in long hair like elements, from head to the feet. It also had a very unforgettable smell. As I got to my feet, I turned and ran in the direction from which I had come. As I passed my friends, who were running into the woods, I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Don't go that way. There is something back there," and I ran into it. One question that always arises is the fact that it was dark, and we were in a wooded area. I can't recall if the moon was bright that night, but the lights from the park and the nearby homes made this particular area fairly bright. My friends say that I ran into a tree. I asked them to show me the scratches, bumps, and bruises that a tree would surely leave on my face and body. Although they were skeptical, none of these brave souls would venture back to where I had just been. We lingered close to that pool until the caretaker, whom we called Lighthorse, just a name we had given him, had left the area. Then, we all returned to our homes. Most of us lived within a half-mile from the pool, and many of us living along the Monongahela River. One of the friends that was with me that night was my brother, Joe. He remembers the nights, but he still laughs when I mention the happening. Laugh if you must, but this story is absolutely true. Late at night, in or about July 1975, I heard a large noise in the woods in front of our house. Although it was dark, it was a clear night and quite warm. I looked down into the woods and saw 2 very large red eyes staring back at me. At first, I thought it was a deer, but I realized that they were way too high up, and I heard what sounded like long, slow breaths. I went in, got a flashlight, and shined it down there, but whatever it was had gone. In the morning, I went down to the spot and found no discernible prints, but the ground had been heavily trampled. It should be noted that there are many abandoned coke ovens within a quarter-mile of here, and a fresh running stream right below them. The incident in Zaleski happened years later and involved a feeling of utter terror. I saw nothing, but several days later, the Columbus Dispatch reported a number of Bigfoot sightings were coming from the exact area that was in 1980. I have debated whether or not to report my encounter to the BFRO or any organization. I don't know why, but I guess I wanted to keep this experience to myself for a few years. And then it just didn't seem to matter as far as reporting it. But now, I realize that all encounters need to be in a database somewhere. These do exist, and when that day of discovery happens, this database will house many of the answers. My encounter happened in early June of 2010. I took a friend to the Marionville Timberline ATV trails, just northeast of Marionville, Pennsylvania, and the Allegheny National Forest, to ride ATVs for the day. Allegheny National Forest covers approximately 515,000 acres, or 800 square miles of protected wilderness here in northwestern Pennsylvania. The forest is pretty dense in most spots and has many types of terrain. From my understanding, the Allegheny National Forest is one of the least densely populated areas east of the Mississippi River. Surrounding the forest are more woodlands and farm country. The two trail systems we were riding that weekend join together and make an approximate 60 to 80 mile loop from the northern end down to the bottom, and then back up the other side of the loop. My encounter happened on our return back up, heading northbound. I remember that it rained very hard the night before and through the early morning because my friend, who at the time was new to ATVing, did not bring any rain gear. We had to go into town to buy him some cheap rain gear, and then headed up the trail. It rained the first half hour or so of our ride, and I remember the sun coming out, and it was turning into a really nice day for a ride. For those that ride ATVs, they know that the rain makes mud, which is more fun to ride in than dust. Well, a few hours into the ride, having stopped and observed some beaver dams, some very old oil wells, a couple logged out areas where you could see what seemed like miles of other cool sights that the forest has to offer. I, getting in more of a hurry to get back, it was approaching the end of the day. My buddy was way behind me, so I decided to stop on the trail and wait. I usually don't separate from ATV buddies when riding, but this part of the trail was an abandoned logging trail, and pretty easy, so I rode ahead a while, and then decided to stop and wait for him. He didn't ride fast or dangerous. He just kind of putted along, so I knew he was safe, just slow. If he didn't show up, I would turn around and meet up with him. I wasn't sitting long. I just took my helmet off. That's when I noticed rocks kept hitting the front right side of my ATV. They weren't large rocks, maybe about or just smaller than hand-sized. It took a minute or so before it occurred to me that I was stopped and that rocks should not be flying through the air and hitting my ATV. I was turning my head towards the right to follow the path of these air rocks, as I call them, when my turn stopped. I noticed this stump, which turned out to be a dark figure, around 90 feet away, that appeared to be in a sitting or crouching, or just a low position. Then, stand into an upright position. I'll never forget how it seemed to pop right up, like it was on a spring, with very little effort. Initially, I looked at its hands because I was interested to see what was in its hand, if anything. It was much taller than a normal human. Best guess at this point would be 7.5 feet or so, and absolutely not a bear. It was very broad at the shoulders, almost freakishly broad. I remember that very well. It was on 2 legs, and I could see its right arm hanging down, which was on the left side, because it was facing me. I remember wanting to watch its right hand to see if it was armed, or what it might be doing. That is funny to me now, because for some reason, I just assumed it was right-handed. It moved its right arm to slightly bent position, stopping with its hand in front of it, at about its waist. Its left arm staying hanging to its side. Again, very long arms. It was all very dark black. A shiny black, from head to toe, or as far as I could see to its feet, as it was standing in roughly 2 feet tall grass, or taller. As my eyes made their way up on the creature, I could see its head was all black as well. There was no white or lighter color that stood out. like most animals would have on their face. I could not see clear details of the face, as it was all black as well. But it did not appear to have hair on its face. It appeared to be black skin, the same color black as its hair, but I could tell it wasn't hair in some spots. I noticed that the eyes were black, or very dark and deep, with a very pronounced brow ridge. I could obviously tell it had a face. I just couldn't see defined details of lips or anything, as it was all the same color. The lips were closed, though in a straight line across its face. Not open-mouthed, or smile or frown. Just straight, mono-expressive lips. The hair was short to medium length, and not shaggy. I'd say the hair was an average of 3 to 5 inches long. Shorter on the head, though. It was almost groomed in appearance, but I think it's from the hair being short and thick. At least, that was my impression. Oddly, I did not notice any mud or dirt all over it, which seemed odd because it had rained hard the night before, and didn't stop until several hours before this. The trails were muddy. Almost as soon as my eyes were at its head and face, I was trying to zoom in and get a better look at the face. It began to leave. It didn't just turn and walk away, but rather it stepped straight backwards into the brush and the trees, and not take its eyes away from me. It stayed square to me as it was moving backwards. This all happened in a span of no more than 30 seconds. From the time I noticed the rocks hitting my ATV, up until it moved backwards. When I play it over and over in my mind, it seems more like 30 minutes. At this point, an overwhelming fear just filled my entire mind, and I remember feeling like I shouldn't be in this spot right now. I don't remember shaking in fear or anything like that, but I felt warm, almost like I was going to puke. So, I hit the gas and took off. I wish now that I wouldn't have just fled, but the feeling that came over me was not like I'd ever experienced before. I had my smartphone in my fender bag, but it never occurred to me to get it out and start video. I honestly couldn't move for a short period of time. I've been surprised by people walking up on me in the woods, and have hunted all my life. So animal encounters, even bear from a distance, they don't scare me or alarm me. I was in the military for roughly 6 years, and actually had the honor to serve as SEAL Team 4 and SDV Team 2, the old UDT Team 2, support, as part of a special warfare boat crew. During that time, I had many highly anxious experiences, as one could imagine. To summarize, I'm pretty observant, and I do not have a tendency to overreact, and I don't in any way scare easy. I am very level-headed, and definitely not crazy. I didn't think instantly Bigfoot, as I wasn't a real believer then. At least, I doubted their existence in the eastern US, and if they did exist, it was only in the northwest US, Canada, or Alaska. This encounter took my emotions to places they had never been, or at least had not been for a very long time. It has been going through my head now for well over 4 years. I didn't tell anybody except my fiancée within the first year after the encounter. Now, quite a few people know. The person I was riding with that day just found out in 2014. I never told him about the story before, but because I couldn't remember if it was springtime or early summer, late summer, fall when this happened, I asked him what week if he remembered. When he told me it was springtime, early summer, he naturally asked why, what's up. I told him what had happened. It turns out that he believes in these creatures too. He then realized why I was acting so weird when we finally got back up and got caught up with each other. and then on the 2.5-hour truck ride home. Now, I wish I would have told him then. Maybe we could have joined together and gone back to look for signs or whatever we could find. Instead, the overwhelming feeling of what was that, and I can't tell anybody, they won't believe me anyway, took over. And ultimately, I kept it to myself. Nobody has to tell me what I saw or did not see. I knew what I saw. I saw a large, dark figure with hair that could throw rocks, and very accurately, stand up within 100 feet of me in a large, dense forest where there are not any cabins or people just casually hanging out. I still do leave the option open for an extremely large man, larger than anyone I've ever met, in a heavily padded ghillie suit with hair on it, standing about 100 feet from the trail, just waiting for somebody to stop in that exact spot, so he could throw rocks at him and take a chance of getting shot. Most folks on ATVs will pack a handgun when riding in deep woods. At least, that's my experience. Now, that's being sarcastic, but trying to make a truth out of what happened. Of course, that option is slim, but it will always be there, as I didn't walk up to this thing and shake its hand or hug it. So, being 100% sure it was a Sasquatch just is not possible. I am at 99.999% sure, though. I do know that a fear like I've not felt in a long time, if ever, took me over for a while. Something told me to not go, to move on, that I shouldn't be here right now. Again, I'm a very rational person, and this just didn't make any sense to me at all. I eventually plan on returning to that general area, on ATV, and parking the bike, and doing some walking. I just need to look around and feel comfortable with that. Ever since my encounter, I can't put this down. I've been researching since, and came across various online groups that discuss encounters. I'm wanting to learn as much as I can before returning and looking around, and want to go armed with more knowledge than I have now. Here is an update. I have returned to this trail 5.5 years later, and found the area that this happened in. It was strange being there. Some of my biggest questions since learning more about these creatures are, what was it doing there, close to used ATV trails? And why did it draw attention to itself? If this thing had never thrown rocks, I would have not looked, and if it had not stood up, I probably would not have even noticed it. Someone told me that maybe it was traveling, and recently crossed that trail. The reason for rock throwing and drawing attention to it was possibly to draw attention to it on purpose, so my attention wouldn't go to something else nearby, lest able to protect itself. I interpret that as young ones. That never crossed my mind. Just to realize that one was in the area blew my mind away, and made me start thinking differently about what could be out there. Now, there may have been more. I'll never know that for sure, but it does make sense to that question that's been bugging me. I now wonder if they were young close to me. Maybe they were throwing the rocks, being mischievous. It's still hard for me to grasp that anything could throw rocks from approximately 90 feet away and hit the same general area. Very, very accurate. If it wanted to harm me, it would have beamed me in the head, and I wouldn't be writing this encounter. I've since been researching an area about 25 miles west of this same location. I went from not caring or even thinking about Sasquatch to now a full-blown enthusiast. I attend conferences and have actually received an invitation to Bigfoot in Oregon in 2016. For these years, the Ohio Bigfoot Conference, Mr. Irwin, who's a BFRO member and artist, is doing a drawing of what I've described to her, and will be unveiling it at the conference. All of this is exciting, and I cannot wait to see her bring this back to life and return my emotions back to that 1 minute of my life that changed how I think now. I cannot attach that picture yet, as the Ohio Bigfoot Conference director has asked not to put it out there until after the conference. But if you would like, I can come back to this and attach the drawing, which will be as close to what I saw as possible. Also, for more info on this, the guys from Monster X Internet Radio contacted me and asked if I would come on their show. They saw my encounter on a group. I agreed and did a 2-hour show with them, discussing this event. Google Monster X Dave Groves. I'm not looking for any type of notoriety out of this. It's why I have not put up a report. But they found me and asked, so I agreed. I feel that folks need to know about this, and that these creatures do exist. Anybody who knows me will tell you, I'm a very honest person. It is one of my strong qualities. I know there are many made-up hoax Bigfoot stories out there, but I can assure you, this is not one of them. I wasn't out looking for a Bigfoot that day. I did not ask for this encounter to happen, but it did, and it changed many things about me. I stopped hunting deer, and have not hunted since that day. I now cannot put Bigfoot stuff down, and have even begun a Bigfoot book collection with some very old and hard to find autographed Bigfoot books. This doesn't happen to a person overnight, unless something occurred to change them. That day certainly did change me. If you, or someone you know, has an encounter or story they would like to share with me, please send it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com.